Hello again and welcome. And in this section, we'll finally be discussing the Sicilian defense. So the Sicilian is associated with the moves e4, c5, and it's the most popular and the best scoring response against white's first move 1 times 10 to the power of 4. So black takes control of the d4 square, and he aims to fights for space by controlling the dark squares. Then he can further control with his pieces. So black seeks for an uncompromising position with an asymmetrical pawn structure because black advances his bishop's pawn quickly in an early part of the game. So, the Sicilian is very combative because in many lines black is not only playing for solid equality, but it's also fighting for the advantage and for uncompromising play. Because in many lines the c file gets opened and black gets dark square control, and he gets his pieces out also very quickly. The downside of playing the Sicilian is that first it doesn't develop any pieces at the moment, and it doesn't control any squares along the e-file compared to the first one with 1 e5. In addition, black's bishop on f8 will need some time to get itself out into the game, and black has to be careful not to fall victim under a strong and fast attack, because white can quickly develop his pieces. We can quickly bring our knights out into the game. Then we can even advance our d-pawn twice, which in the Sicilian white often does. And for example, after knight of 3-fold by d4, all our pieces quickly get developed. The knight gets to the center or the queen gets to the center, and meanwhile both diagonals for our bishops become open. So the Sicilian makes up for many of the exciting games in the first move 1 times 10 to the power of 4. White has to act quickly, otherwise black and equalize can get these pieces out. And so we need to make use of our temporary advantage in terms of the initiative. So after c5, I'm recommending the move knight f3, which is the main move for white here, and the most logical because we follow the general principles, the general opening principle of developing your king's knight first before your queen's knight, and develop your knights first before the bishop. So we play knight f3. White has other choices here on move 2, such as the second move knight c3, which can later transpose if white plays an eventual knight f3. But knight c3, there are many different lines for white here. For example, after knight c6 or d6, white can play f4, which is the Grand Prix attack, where white gets some space on the king's side. White can play g3 and head for a close Sicilian structure with the idea to find Cetto the bishop on g2. It's also a solid choice. Meanwhile, I move to, well, white also has the all-up-in Sicilian with the second move c3 with the idea to create a strong pawn center. But this will not be covered in the course. And the all-up-in Sicilian leads to a very different kind of position than what we're going to get. Knight c3 also leads to very different kinds of a position, which is not what we're going for. So I recommend the second move knight f3. And to begin with, I just want to tell you that in this course, we won't be discussing the open Sicilian. So we won't be discussing the open Sicilian mainly because of the problems with space. If you play the open Sicilian Black Ops, 10 or 11 different setups, and it's hard to imagine that. All of them can be covered in one course. There's just too much space. Probably need a full course in order to cover all the lines in the open Sicilian, if not more. As you can see, there has been a lot of opening apparent or books for white with the open Sicilian, and they generally cannot put all together in one book. So, even though the open Sicilian is the most principled and most aggressive variation against the Sicilian, unfortunately in terms of space, I could not include it all in this course, but I'll mention it briefly. So after knight f3, Black Op's 3 main moves, he can play e6 with the idea to go for the Taimanov Sicilian or the Paulson Convariation or black. Black immediately opens the diagonal for his dark squared bishop at the cost of blocking the diagonal of the light squared bishop. So there's e6. There's the move knight c6, which actually used to be my favorite move back in my childhood days. I used to play the Sicilian with knight c6. From the beginning of my career all the way till I was about 14 or 1,314 years old. So this move has also been used by Magnus Carlsen exclusively in the recent World Championship match against Fabiano Caruana in 2018. And on move 3, black's main move here is playing d6, taking control of the e5 square. So now black can move his knight to f6 without having to worry about e5. And in addition, black also opens the diagonal for his light squared bishop. And yeah, we'll also discuss this briefly. So in this course against move 3 times 10 to the power of 6, I'm not recommending the move d4 because that leads to a lot of lines in the open Sicilian. So in this course, I'm going to be recommending g3, which is a rare line, and it's not open scene, but I believe it's a very good surprise weapon. I have tried this move on move 3g3 myself in a few games last year, and generally, I got good results. So I believe on move 3g3 is a very good weapon. It's very effective as a surprise weapon, but it's also very logical, and it leads to a solid and stable positions for white. So we just want to find Cheto the bishop and make use of the fact that black has played e6, and he can no longer go for the d6 e5 setups against the black's other main move, knight c6. I'm going to be recommending in this course the Rossolimo Sicilian with the third move, bishop b5. And this move has been favored by a lot of strong grandmasters such as Fabiano Caruana. He's used it many games. Leonardo Dominguez Perez, a very strong Cuban-American grandmaster who is extremely strong theoretically in the openings. Also, Magnus Carlsen has played this with white. Lee Von Aronian has played it. Maxim Bakker-Lagrave Anish Giri has played it also. So I believe on move to move 3 against the Sicilian with knight c6. I believe that bishop e5 is a very effective weapon, and it's probably just as good as dope and Sicilian in terms of raw strength against the second move, knight c6, so white attacks the knight on move 2. If black plays d6, I'm also going to be recommending the bishop b5 check Sicilian, which has also become very popular in the last few years, recent years, because white was having problems getting an advantage against the Sicilian knight dwarf. So a lot of white players have turned their attention to this move. Third move, bishop e5 check, when black has to figure out a way how to block the check first of all. So it's made the main line here is knight d7 with the idea to try to win the bishop there. Alternatively, black can play knight c6 and cover the check this way, but this move is not very popular anymore. I think white has a couple of ways to get an advantage against it. Alternatively, black can play and move through bishop d7 and try to cover the check this way. So in this course, I'm going to be recommending the bishop b5 Sicilians, but let's see first. So on d6, if you're interested, you can also. It's also a good idea to have the open Sicilian as a repertoire in reserve. Or sometimes it's nice to have more than one repertoire against black's openings. So let's talk a little bit about the open Sicilian, which is, I believe, the most principled response against c5. So after d4, black takes, knight takes. White can also take with the queen here with queen, takes d4, but it leads to a more positional way of playing chess. So knight takes is the most aggressive move, and then black plays knight f6 to attack this pawn, and then white plays knight c3, and here a6 is the Najdorf Sicilian, and it's the most popular Sicilian variation for black. So against the Najdorf, white has maybe 12 different variations or 12 different ways of playing. But I believe that the English attack with f3 followed by bishop e3 is the critical response against the Najdorf, and I believe it always will be the critical response. Obviously white has different ways of playing, but I think on move 6 f3 is a good choice against the Najdorf, and I suggest f3 because after bishop e3 black gets this annoying move knight g4, which leads to a completely different way of it, leads to completely different kind of positions because black attacks the bishop, and if the bishop moves here then black can further harass our bishop and fianchetto, his own dark squared bishop on the strong a1 ha diagonal. So if you're interested on learning the open Sicilian, then I believe the English attack is a good choice against the Sicilian Najdorf. And after e5, knight b3, bishop e6, bishop e3. As of the moment, black has different variations, but the most critical variations in the English attack are here on move 7, bishop e7, queen d2, short castle, long castle, and then black plays knight bd7. And then we are all set. White attacks on the king's side by pushing his king's side pawns, and black attacks on the queen's side by pushing the queen's side pawns. And there's been a lot of games and theory in this line, and I believe the final word hasn't been said as of moment, but there's always room for improvement and for surprise in this lines. Black's other way of playing this position is by pushing his h-pawn twice or 2 squares. So this also critical, and it's a more solid way of playing the Najdorf with black. So black prevents us from advancing our g-pawn, and after queen d2, then he can either play bishop e7 or knight bd7, and after knight d5, black generally takes with the bishop, and then he finds Quito's his other dark squared bishop this way, and this also leads to very interesting positions for both sides. As of the moment, white hasn't proven a clear-cut way for an advantage, as in any line against Najdorf, but with some critical moves, then we force black to defend very accurately. Alternatively, here on move 10, white can also consider castling long instead of knight d5. So castling long here on move 10, with the idea to try to attack on the king side later on, is also critical. And I believe white's position is generally easier to play as black needs to be extremely well prepared in order to equalize. So yeah, the Knight Dwarf has a lot of games and a lot of theory, and I couldn't have possibly covered everything in this course if I were to recommend the English tag. But if you're interested in learning the Open Sicilian, then this is a good choice. Alternatively, black can also play the classical Sicilian by putting his knight on c6 instead of playing a6. So here this line is more committal because black immediately brings his knight to c6. In the Knight Dwarf, black sometimes get the option to develop knight on d7, but here it's already on c6. So after knight c6, white has two critical ways of playing. One move is playing on move 6 f3, again with the idea of playing the English attack with bishop e3. And I actually played this myself recently. And after e5, knight b3, bishop e6, bishop e3, the lines get very interesting here. White can either play knight d5 next move, or alternatively after bishop e7, white can play queen e2 with the idea to cast along. And the lines here are very interesting for both sides. So black has to play accurately also. So this is a good choice against the classical Sicilian. And the idea of playing queen e2, by the way, is that if you play queen d2, black can play d5 and then equalize this way. Because if you take on d5, he takes with the queen. But the main point of queen e2 move 9 is that after d5, he takes knight picks. White king castle short, and then use this spin along the d file to a very good effect. So after queen it to black should just castle short, and then white castles long, and then we get this typical English attack setup, once again with opposite castled kings. Alternatively, on move 6, white's main line against the classical Sicilian is a 6-move bishop g5, which is called the Rouser variation or the richer Rouser bishop g5. And here black has many lines such as bishop d7 or queen b6. But black usually plays here e6 to take control of the d5 square. And then white replies queen to d2, with the idea to castle long, and generally in the past, this line has a very good theory considers white to be preferable in many of these lines. Black can play bishop e7, followed by castling short, which is the old main line of the rich to Rouser. Alternatively, a6 has become a lot more popular lately in the last year or so. Black's idea is after long castle, he plays bishop d7, protecting the knight on c6 and preparing to create counterplay on the queen side by playing b5. And this variation has become very popular in the top level recently, with many strong grass masters playing it for both sides. For example, Daniel Dibab has played this in a few games with the black pieces. Elira Zafaratska, also a very strong Iranian teenager. Pinam has also played this fearlessly. Maxime Bakarlagrabi has tried this. Sam Shanklin, Vidic Koreedi, etc., etc. They tried this with black. So this also critical. And here white has a choice. White can either play f3, with the idea to protect the pawn on e4, again with similar ideas as in the English attack. And I like this personally myself with the white pieces. White just wants to gain space, and we protect the e4 pawn solidly, and then we develop the rest of our pieces, and then we use our space advantage thanks to our advanced pawn on e4. And it's a very positional way of playing chess. But of course I can't say that I've found an advantage for white here. Alternatively, on move 9, white's other choice is to play the more aggressive move, f4, advancing the f-pawn in 2 squares and taking control of the e5 square. Here, black can either play b5, and after bishop takes f6, black cannot take with the queen because of the move e5, attacking the queen and the pawn. And after d takes, I believe knight d takes b5 is winning for white here, threatening knight c7 and also threatening the bishop on d7. So after bishop takes, black has to take with the g-pawn, and there have been quite a number of games here. Most of the games continue with king b1, moving the king away from the c-file. The king is almost always better placed on b1 than on c1. In the Open Sicilian, black plays queen b6 to attack the knight, takes f5, and then white attacks the vulnerable pawns on the center, and then black plays queen c5, with the idea to take control of the central squares, and then black plays bishop. Sorry, white plays bishop d3, developing the bishop. And then recently there's been a few games played with the move h5. Okay, b4 is also possible, kicking the white knight away, but recently there's been a number of games played with the move h5, with the idea to activate the dark squared bishop this way with bishop h6, and objectively white is probably better here, but at the same time black has the two bishops, and there he has counterplay. I think it's dark square control, so both players need to be accurate in this position. So that's one of the reasons why I prefer f3 on move 9. It's because the rising positions are more stable after f4. Besides b5, black can also play the move bishop e7, which is the second most popular move behind b5. And then after knight f3 with the idea to play e5, black plays b5 intending to meet e5 with an attack on, with a counterattack on the opponent's knight with b4, but the main line here is bishop takes f6, taking advantage of the fact that black another capture with the bishop as the pawn on d6 is hanging. So then the theory goes here. G takes f6, king b1 protecting the pawn on a2 and improving the position of our king queen b6, and now f5. And black castles long in order to safeguard the position of this king. And here white has a number of choices. The most common plan is to play g3 followed by bishop h3 either before or after taking on e6. And I believe white's position is easier to play here, but in practice both sides have chances So yeah, this variation with the a6 and bishop d7 in the classical Sicilian has seen a resurgence in modern times, and there have been quite a lot of proponents for black in this positions. But I believe white is a little better after either f3 or f4, but nevertheless there's a lot of theory. On move 5, black can play e6 also, and this is the Scheveningen opening or the Scheveningen setup. Sorry, which used to be a personal favorite of Garry Kasparov back in the 80s and in the 90s. I believe he's played this a few times in his first World Championship match against Anatoly Karpov. So it has similar ideas as in the Najdorf, but a black immediately commits to the setup with e6, putting the pawns here and opting for Scheveningen setup. So against e6, white has two critical replies. The most critical reply is the move g4, which is the Scheveningen Kara's attack. So white advances the pawn 2 squares, taking advantage of the fact that the bishop is no longer attacking g4 and g4 threatening g5. So black has to play h6 here to prevent g5, and now after h4 with the idea to continue pushing rook g1 with tidy up g5, and now black plays h5, and there's been quite some games here. Also recently, I believe this move was played by Garry Kasparov in the past, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he's played this in 1984 against Anatoly Karpov. So a very instructive line, be considering this. He played this 36 years ago. So h5 here in the position is probably better for white, but it's not very clear. Black's idea is to post his knight on g, for if white advances with g5, and then he's attacking the f2 square, and he can retreat or he can play queen b6 next move. Alternatively, against the Scheveningen attack, you can also just simply play bishop e3 and up for the English attack set up with f3. And yeah, again, there's quite a bit of theory here, especially if black plays a6 transposing to the Najdorf variation of the Scheveningen. So b5, and here the main line I believe is queen d2 followed by g4, queen d2 followed by g4 with, where black has to be very accurate in order to survive the opening. Alternatively, white can also play here the quiet move a3, which this move has become fashionable in recent months. White's idea is to prevent black from advancing his b-pawn and kicking away our knight. So a3 is interesting here, preventing b4, and meanwhile, if black plays knight bd7, then white can continue advancing on the king side with g4. Meanwhile, we prevent black from creating counterplay at the moment. So I've also played this position a few times in this games, and generally, I found white's position to be a bit easier to play. But of course you need to be prepared. On move 5, like as other moves, bishop d7 here is not very threatening. I only mention it because I believe Magnus Carlsen has played this line. Current world champion Magnus Carlsen. Yeah, he's played this line in a number of games in the last year in 2020, but also in the past. So bishop d7 is, how should I say? It's also interesting. It's not easily refuted. So black's idea is to, well, develop the bishop here and prepare knight c6. And meanwhile he's very flexible, and he prevents us from advancing our g-pawn to squares at the moment. So here after bishop d7, white has two main critical replies. The first move is bishop g5 to play, as in the reach the rouser, and then black plays e6. And now we can see the point of this variation. Black's main idea here is if we play the move queen d2, then he can play of it. then he plays a6. Okay, so this is the line. So after queen d2, black plays a6, and compared to the rich Strauser, his knight is on b8. And if he castles, black plays h6, attacking our bishop. And this is the point of playing bishop d7 on move 5. So he plays here, and if our bishop retreats, then black hunts the bishop down. Meanwhile, if you play bishop h4, then black has this nice trick. Knight takes e4, grabbing a pawn and attacking our queen. And if we take on his queen, he takes here, and our bishop on d8 is attacked. And if we move the bishop, then he can take f1, and black is a pawn up. So this is the main point of black's fifth move, bishop d7. Here white can play queen f4 and get compensation for the pawn. So on move 7 after e6, white's main move here is knight db5 attacking the pawn on c6. And if black plays bishop c6, then we can take on f6 and ruin black's kingside pawns because he cannot take with the queen due to knight c7. And after g takes h6, queen h5 is known to be strong for white as black's center pawns are doubled, and the pawn e6 is quite vulnerable after knight d4. So after knight d5, I believe this has been played by Maxim Bakker-Lagrave against Magnus Carlsen in 2019. I think the Grand Chester tournament. So Magnus took on b5, and then he played knight c6. So black surrenders the bishop pair, but in their turn he developed his pieces. White does some interesting tries here, such as on move 9 times 10 to the power of 5, with the idea to open up to the center and play queen f3. Play queen f3. But Maxim played queen f3 on move 9, which is probably a main line. And then Magnus played the move bishop e7, and black is preparing to the castle short, and after e5. Maxim played e5 with idea taken c6, and the main move for black here is knight d5, and also the most solid. But Magnus took on e5 with the pawn, and later he outplayed Maxim anyway, and won the game. So it remains to be seen how white gets a clear advantage after knight c6, or if he has a clear advantage at all the other. Critical response against fifth move bishop d7 is by playing f3, again sticking to the same old English attack. We don't play. Why doesn't play bishop e3 here? Because again the response 9g4 is annoying, forcing our bishop to move. So I believe f3 on move 6 is also a critical response here with the idea to play bishop e3 next move. Black can play e5 attacking our knight, and then bishop e3 fold by queen d2 and long castle, and we get the typical setup of an English attack. But yeah, move 5, bishop d7 is rarely seen. Black's other main line here on move 5. I mean, of course, he's got some rare alternatives such as e5, but his other main try is the dragon variation with g6, and so-called because of the pawn structure here, h7 g6 all the way to d6. I think it resembled like a moving dragon figure in the old days, so people started calling it the dragon variation. It used to be very famous back then. Guy Kasparovas played it in World Championship match against V. Shianen back in 1996 or 1995 in New York. So Guy Kasparov uses opening as a surprise weapon. The problem with the dragon is after white's best reply bishop ither, which is the English attack f3. So this called the Yugoslav attack in the dragon knight v6 queen d2 castle. So the problem with the dragon variation these days is black has to play very precisely in order to get equality, and he has to defend the position precisely. He has to find the sometimes only defenses. And here on the dragon, white has to get two good replies. The Yugoslav attack with bishop c4. Activating the bishop this way is of course very critical, and black generally responds with bishop d7 followed by rook c8. But I believe black has a difficult time here theoretically. The other simple response against the dragon is not to play bishop c4, but just to castle along. If black plays bishop d7, then we are ready to advance on the king's side by playing g4. Fall by h4, and we don't lose time developing the light squared bishop. But after long castle, black's main move is d5 here, creating counterplay on the center. And this move is very popular and famous. Probably see it in dozens of opening books. So e takes d5, knight takes d5, takes. Black sacrifices this a pawn on d5, but generally it's recommended for white not to take it. Because if you take, black has this powerful move queen c7 when he's down a pawn, but his bishops are active, and his queen is active, and he's threatening bishop f5. So black is doing all right here. But But the critical line in this position on move 12 is on 12 move white plays bishop d4, and I believe black has some d. Pretty difficult problems in this line with bishop d4. Black can either play e5 to try to keep the dark squared bishops, or he can take on d4. He can also take on d4 and try to simplify. But after the move knight a4, of course there's quite a number of fury here, but if you check the recent games and Karen Fury, it seems that black is under quite a bit of pressure in this line, so long castle followed by bishop d4 in this position. It's a very good line against the dragon, but of course we need to go deeper and analyze the lines arising after e5, bishop c5, bishop e6, 9 times 10 to the power of 4, or alternatively, on move 12 black can also take here and play queen b6. But after knight a4, I believe white is doing well. We have an outpost on the c5 square, but dragon is not very famous in the top level anymore because it's too concrete. So on move to black can also play e6. And again, this course I'm recommending g3, but I'll just mention briefly the open Sicilian with d4 takes. And here black can either play knight f6, but after knight c3, black has probably nothing better than to go for the Scheveningen setup with d6, or to play knight c6 and to transpose to the Sicilian 4 knights, which black's other two main lines here are the Kahn variation and the Kahn pulsing with a6, which is a very flexible way of playing. Black is preparing b5, and he takes b5 square under his control. But the disadvantage of the Kahn setup is that black does not provoke the white knight to jump to the c3 square, and therefore in many lines later, white gets the option to set up a Maroki position with c4. For instance, c4 is playable now, and white has different chances for an advantage. Alternatively, the main line is bishop d3 with idea to castle short, and later play c4, and black has different setups here. He can play knight f6, or alternatively, he can play bishop c5 attacking the knight, and then he can either play bishop a7 or bishop e7 with complex play, and we generally get the Amaroxy sort of position here, where black plays d6 and white puts the pawn on c4. But again, the Paulsen Kahn, or the Canver, the Sicilian Kahn, is a very complex opening where black accepts a position where he is behind in space. But generally black gets this hedgehog sort of structure with pawns on d6 and probably another pawn on b6. And so it appeals to black players who like playing the hedgehog. The hedgehog, by the way, is a position where black puts most of his pawns on the third rank or on the sixth rank, for example d6 and b6, and this is the hedgehog setup, which can arise in many different openings, such as the English opening or the Sicilian, where black puts his pawns on e6, d6, b6, a6 from where they're passive, but they control a lot of squares, and black develops his pieces behind this solid pawn wall. So I don't personally like it with black, because I think it's very passive, and it gives white more room and space for his pieces. But at the same time, this variation is very old and very classical. And there have been many thousands of games played with this setup, if not hundreds of thousands. But anyway, on move 4, black can also play the move knight c6 and knight c3, and then after queen c7, this is the Sicilian Taimanov, which I believe has been widely written about, and I think even Sasabo has a course with the Sicilian Taimanov. So this variation is very topical. Also, for example, Fabiano Caruana has played this, or has been playing the Selen Taimanov in recent times, and he's playing this regularly. Sam Shanklin also played this with black. Jan-Christoph Duda has played this in a couple of games, etc. So the Selen Taimanov is another serious setup, and I believe the most critical move for white is again to play bishop e3. White does other tries, such as bishop e2 g3 fianchetto system or f4, but I believe that the English attack is still the most critical response on the Sicilian. Black generally plays a6 here to take control of the b5 square, because if he plays the move knight f6 without a6, then why does this nice response here, f4, which in this position is very good, because we can make use of the b5 square for us. So we're threatening e5, and bishop b4 is met by knight db5 attacking the queen, taking advantage of the fact that That black hasn't played a6, and the idea is after queen e5 we gain a tempo attacking the black knight with e5, knight d5, bishop d2, and I think after the moment white has. White has some advantage in this line either after taking with the pawn and playing for the initiative or after bishop takes e3 castle queen d2. Our queen protects the dark squares on the queen side, and later we can castle along, and so black has some problems here. So generally he tends to avoid this line with knight at 6f4, and he plays a6, and here white has two critical tries. The classical main line of queen d2 followed by castling long, and playing for this English attack main line setup is very critical, and this is the main line against the Timon of Sicilian. I believe white has decent chances here. Alternatively, on move 7, there's this move queen f3, which I believe has been first popularized by, if I'm not mistaken, Fabiano Caruana has played this before several years ago in the past. So this line is also critical, and it's a good alternative to 7 move queen d2. So white wants to cast along, and later the queen on f3 can move to g3, where it attacks both the g7 square and the h to b8 diagonal. So here I believe white has decent chances for an advantage also, but white needs to know some theory, especially if black is well prepared. But yeah, the time and knob is a very concrete opening for both sides, and it requires a good memory and some decent analysis and also experience, of course, to play this well for either color. On move 5, black can play a 6. Also, this is the Sicilian time and up, where black delays developing the queen to c7. Black's idea is that after in case, white plays bishop e3, then black plays knight f6, and he can try to create quick counterplay on the center after queen d2. And here black no longer has to play queen c7, but he can play bishop b4 and try to create counterplay in the center. So on move 5 a6 this has advantages and disadvantages, of course. So the advantage is black tries to save on the move queen c7. So later black doesn't have to play queen c7 if he doesn't want to. The disadvantage is it gives white the extra option of knight takes c6, b takes c6, and then now white plays bishop d3. So this is one of white's main reply against safe move a6. And the point being is that white gladly takes on c6 because we argue that, or white argues that black has wasted the tempo on playing this move a6, which is not useful because it takes away the a6 square from black's bishop. So here after bishop d3, there's a number of games. Black general plays d5 after short castle, and then he plays either queen c7 or knight f6, but knight f6 is more common. And then white plays rook e1 or queen f3, but rook e1 is the main line, and white's idea is to gain space later on the center by playing e5, and then posting the queen on g4 to attack the g-file. So this another line. Fabiano Caruana has had 2 model games here. In the first game, he beat Veselin Topalov in the Sing Field Cup tournament, which was a very pretty game. And also Fabiano used this move to beat Peter Spidler in Dubai in 2014 in the World Rapid and Blitz. So feel free to check out those games if you're interested to know more about this line. But also recently, white has been having a lot of success with the new move queen f3, with the idea to play bishop f4 or queen g3. So yeah, again, I won't be discussing the open Sicilian in this course, but I'll just take a brief look. So in second move, knight c6, this has been Magnus Carlsen's choice in the World Championship match recently. In 2018, so after d4 takes, black can play e5, and this is the Kalashnikov Sicilian. After knight b5 d6, white's main replies knight c3, knight a3, and yeah, there's quite a number of key over here. White can either play knight d5 next move or improve the position of our queen's knight by playing knight c4 fold by knight e3. But the Kalashnikov is a very solid setup for black. It has been played by Timur Rajbov recently in a number of games. Magnus Carlsen also plays it from time to time. Daniel Dubov has also tried this move. Personally, I don't like the Kalashnikov that much, and I'd rather prefer to stick to the Sevashnikov system. So, after knight f6, knight c3, Dasavesnikov starts after the move e5, attacking white's knight and forcing him to either retreat or go forward. White generally plays knight db5 to threaten to give a check here. And after d6, the main point of Dasavesnikov is black gains, sometime attacking white's knights. So for example, after the main line bishop g5, black plays a6 and forcing our knight, and then after b5. So we've spent a lot of moves on our knight, or on our king's knight. So we've spent 4 moves out of the August first moves. So 1,234. So it's never a good thing to demove your to move any single piece over and over again at an early stage of the game. So at the moment our knight on a3 is badly placed, and black is threatening to grab a piece. So in this position, white has two main moves. White can either take on f6, more or less forcing black to take on f6 and ruin his kingside pawn. And now black has two main lines. He can either play bishop g7, which is the Nebo-Zebert variation. I believe that's what it's called. Or is it the Pelican variation? But anyway, bishop g7 has been favored by Magnus Carlsen. Black's idea is to fight for the center, either with knight e7 or with f5. f5 is also good here in this position, and so far white has not proven a way for an advantage in any of those lines. Move 10 knight on move 99 d5 is my personal preference because it's a more positional way of playing, because after bishop e7, bishop takes. White has firm control on the e4 and d5 square at the moment, and compared to the other line, black has no counterplay with the move f5. So after bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. White can either play in this position. White has two main tries. White can either play c4, solidifying our control over the light squares. And after knight c200, black has an outpost on d4 for his knight, but as of the moment we are making sure it's covered. And yet, this position is playable for both sides alternatively. On move 11, there's this move c3, which is the classical setup against the Sicilian Sebeshikov. And this used to be Anatoly Karpov's favorite response against Sebeshikov. And Guy Kasparov also has had many beautiful games in this line with white. So white's idea is to bring the knight to c2 and activate our queenside knight, at the same time threatening to play a4 to weaken black's queenside light squares, and so on and so forth. So far, after bishop g5, knight c2, and now the main line for black is to play rook b8, so that after a4 b takes a4, the pawn on b2 is attacked, and that's the whole idea of playing rook b8. So after rb8i, I've had a couple of games or 2 or 3 games with the white pieces here, but so far white hasn't found any advantage as of yet. But of course we can force black to play precisely. But yeah, the theory of this line changes very quickly. And as of the moment, black is doing all right, but he has to know a lot of lines. So the Sicilian Sebeshnikov is a very solid opening, and it's going to take a lot of material to cover it. On move 5, there's also the Sicilian for 4 knights with e6, but this move is not as good as the Sebeshnikov. Black's idea is that after knight b5 d6, he just wants to transpose to the Sevashnikov without having to worry about annoying 7-move lines such as knight d5 here. We just been played by Fabian Caruana in the World Championship match, but I'm not exactly convinced that knight d5 gives white anything after takes, and now I believe knight b8 is more solid. Then knight e7, so knight b8 followed by bishop e7 and short castling. Black quickly finishes his kingside development, and yeah, I mean white can play this position. Obviously Fabiano Caruana played a4, and this currently the main line bishop e7, bishop e2. Castle, and this position has been played in a lot of games, many games played in this position. So yeah, this line is very topical, has been played in a lot of correspondence games, and Fabiano Caruana popularized it also thanks to him playing in the match. Black can play their knight d7 to activate the knight, or play f5 to gain space on the king side. So far I'm not exactly convinced that white has anything substantial in this position. I think black is doing okay because he's got some space on the center and on the king side, but as I was saying, the Syrian 4 knights with e6. It's not that strong because here white gets the extra option of taking on c6. Black doesn't want to take with the d-pawn, as after queen d8, he loses castling rights, so he takes with the b-pawn, and now we push e5 again, getting a pawn wedge on e5, and now we have a pressure on the d6 and f6 squares, so the main line here for black is, he's got several tries, but the main line is queen c7 attacking the pawn. But after f4 black plays queen b6 trying to exploit the weakness of this diagonal. But after c4 we force the black knight to move from its outpost on b5, and here black can either play knight e3 or he can give a check, and in the theory goes king e2 attacking the black knight on d5. Black plays f5 to try to create counterplay, and after e takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop e3. There's been a number of games here, but the main line goes queen d8 because black wants to be able to recapture an f6 with the queen check grabbing the bishop pair. Now black plays bishop b7 with the idea to play c5 and create counterplay by opening the long diagonal. And here after white's critical line, rook d1, rook c8 preparing c5, and now after the move, rook g1 with the idea of g4. The line here gets very concrete, but this is the critical line against the Sicilian four knights, and I believe white is objectively doing very well theoretically. What at the very least, white's position is a lot easier to play in my opinion. But yeah, some analysis is needed, of course. Here in move 4, black can also play the queen b6 setup. So in almost every line in the Sicilian, black can play an early queen b6 to attack our knight on d4 and to force it to retreat. So knight b3. So our knight is in a more passive place now. But at the same time, the queen on b6 is not very well placed either. And after knight f6, knight c3 e6, bishop d3. I've had a lot of games like this in the white pieces in my younger years, but I mean black's provision is playable, but at the same time I believe white's play is easier. So you can look up the recent games played in this position. White plays bishop e3, next move, to force the black queen to retreat, and then we start pushing on the king side with f4. Then we play queen f3, and then we decide whether we want to castle long or short. So the lines here can be quite concrete, of course, but I believe white should be better. Alternatively, here in move 4, black can also play g6. This is called the accelerated dragon, and it's called accelerated because black finds Kitos his bishop on g7 very quickly at an early stage of the game. The difference, of course, is compared to the dragon variation here our knight is still on b1, and we can play c4, which is the Maroczy bind. White puts the pawns on e4 and c4 and sets up this Maroczy pawn structure where black is behind in space. And after c4, black can either play the setup with let's see bishop g7 attacking the knight. Bishop e3 protects the knight in d4, knight at 6, knight c3. So white and black can either play this position or just there is quite a number of games after d6 castle knight d4 bishop and then bishop d7 with the idea of bishop c6. If I remember correctly, I've seen this recently in an openings book for black, the accelerated dragon, and black generally plays a position where he's behind in space, and he's slightly worse, but position is playable. And here, besides the main move with queen d2, I believe that the move queen d3 is also very interesting with the idea to keep the pawn on e4 protected. And Y's idea is to try to advance on the queen's side right away with the move b4, or if black plays a5. Then we play b3, and after bishop c6, the main idea of queen d3 is to play a3 and to advance on the queen's side with b4. So white-black is slightly behind in space, and his position is solid. But there are not too many proponents of this line, with black on move 10 or with the idea to take on d4 later. Then actually here, white has a very strong move, and that move is knight c2, retreating the knight on from the d4 square, and preventing black from exchanging the pieces, because the point is black is behind in space, so we want to keep as much pieces on the board as possible. And here after rook c8, then we just play rook c1 to protect the pieces on the c file. And if black plays knight e5, then we play b3, protecting the pawns here. So after b3, if black plays a6 with the idea to create counterplay on b5, why does this very strong move knight before not only protecting the knight on c3, so now b5 can be met by simply capturing the pawn. Also later on we can consider rerouting our knight to the d5 square, and here I believe white is much better. This move has been played in a few games, this move knight before, and white generally has very good results. So a6 is met by knight before, and meanwhile after queen a5 we can simply play bishop d2 and force the black queen to retreat. Yeah, so the Maroczy structure. Alternatively, on move 5, black can also play knight f6, knight c3, and then he plays d6 with the idea to take on d4 quickly and force white to recapture with the queen, because we cannot play bishop e3 due to knight g4. And meanwhile, after bishop e2, black takes on d4, and then we get the setup where, again, typical Maroczy setup. Black's idea is that our queen is forced to retreat to the d2 square, because after short castle, black is starting knight g4 grabbing our bishop. So we play queen d2, and after bishop e6 we breach the other critical variation against the Maroczy bind. But here I believe both short castling or rook c1. It's a good reply. And yeah, again, there's quite a bit of theory here. The main line goes queen a5 f3, rook at c8 p3, Now black plays a 6 with the idea to create counterplay on the queen's side. So we move our knight. Queen takes, king takes. Knight d7 takes control of the b6 square, and white plays g4, and so on and so forth. This position is very popular in the past. I'm not sure how popular these days, but this endgame should be slightly better for white thanks to the extra space given by our Meraki punk structure. And that's about it so. We've discussed all the critical lines in the open Sicilian, and as you can see there's a lot of theory and a lot of things that you need to know in order to play the open Sicilian well, and you can't learn it all overnight. So all main improvement comes in a step-by-step basis. So you need time to learn the open Sicilian if you want to play it well, and you need experience. And you need to test it in your own games and analyze your games after that. But definitely an open feeling is a good principle of choice if you want to learn more. But now let's go back to this course. So I moved to white plays knight f3. And this is the most logical move because white takes control of the d4 square, and we develop our king's side knight or our king's knight, and we are one move closer towards being able to castle short, which is always a good choice to have. So here the three main moves for black are e6, d6, and knight c6, but in this section and in the next few, we'll take a look at black's other possibilities on move 2, just to make their preter complete. So now we'll take a look at b6 and also other weird black moves. For example, there's this fascinating move, queen a5, which deserves a mention. I've seen this move long time ago. Black's idea is to pin this pawn. Pin this pawn on d2 and prevent us from playing d4. So queen a5 is a very silly move. White has many good replies. You can play knight c3, you can play c3 to close off the pressure of the queen. But I think bishop e2 is the best. It's the best response. The queen a5 is only good, I believe, for a surprise weapon, because it's not. It's not a very good move, but you're not supposed to develop your queen so early in the game. So after bishop e2, followed by short castling, black doesn't have many good choices. So knight c6 is the best move because if he attacks our pawn on e4 with the pawn still on d7, we can advance our pawn and gain a tempo attacking black's knight. So he moves here castle. Black is so sorely behind development, and after knight c6 we can meet this with d for opening up the center. Knight takes e5 loses due to the move knight b3. Yeah, when the queen on a5 is attacked and the knight on d5 is also attacked, and black loses a piece. If black plays e6, white does the strong move knight b5, immediately grabbing the initiative before black can develop. So c4 is a threat here and black is busted after ab. After knight takes e5, black is temporarily a pawn up. But after knight c3, our knight gets to b5 and black is behind in development, and he cannot defend against the threats. Alternatively, on move 3, black can also play knight c6 as I mentioned after castle. If he plays knight f6, then again e5 fold by opening up the center. It's quite dangerous for black. Meanwhile, if he plays e6 then besides the move d4, going for an open silent pawn structure, which is also better for white because the queen looks very silly on a5. The move feature is also simple and good because black's queen is misplaced, and he probably needs, or she probably needs to spend one further 10 point in order to make the queen's position better. So after c3, black plays knight f6, but now the move knight a3 with the idea to gain the tempo, attacking black's queen with knight c4, pushing her back. And after bishop e7, then now d4 takes knight c4, and white is pleasant play, as our knight controls the crucial square on d6, and black has lost a tempo, moving his queen. So f6 looks quite ugly. And after e takes f6, knight e3, white has a nagging advantage because if black takes, then after bishop takes, d5 is a threat. Meanwhile, after d6, white has a small but nagging advantage. Thanks to the double d pawns on move to black can also play queen c7. It's a weird move, but black hopes to transpose into a Sicilian with an early queen c7 set up after d4. So again after queen c7, this is well met by the move c3, the same idea as the Alapin because now we go for an Alapin variation with the queen badly placed on c7 for example. If knight f6 we have e5 followed by d4 and the black's queen is misplaced. Again, takes can be met by knight a3 with the idea of knight b5. So black plays a6, Dr. queen d4, and now knight c4. White has a strong initiative since our e5 pawn is well protected, and we have pressure on g7 for example, after b5 check. Takes and queen g7, and black can play queen of faith to defend the king's side. But even in the endgame after bishop e2, white is better because of our bishop pair, and also black's dark squares are quite vulnerable, and white is the initiative, so white is better here. Turn dimly on move 3. If black plays d6, then d4 just occupies the center. On knight f6 we can play bishop d3. Alternatively, e5 is also very strong because if black takes, knight fd7 is met by e6, ruining black's kingside pawns. For example, takes bishop d3. Mino as black plays knight g4, then after bishop f4. Black's knight on g4 is misplaced, and after h3, he cannot capture on e5, as this loses a piece due to the move bishop b5 takes. Meanwhile, after e5 is knight of d7, then white has a good choice. He takes the simple e takes d6 is also good enough for a large advantage because after bishop f4, white controls the center. Alternatively, knight a3 on move 6 here is also very good. The main point being that dd knight takes e5 loses due to the move knight b5. When after bishop f4, black cannot prevent this knight c7 idea because here white has a huge lead in development, and black is unable to defend. Bishop c4 is coming. Knight c7 is also a threat. So after d5 black can play knight b6, but after bishop f4 we have a lead in development, and the pawn on e5 is very powerful. So the knight can be routed to e4 later on, and we're actually following a game here after long castle. And bishop c4 white has a huge space advantage, and black squares on e6 and f7 are very vulnerable. And if black takes, then our knight gets to the strong d6 square on move to d5 opens up the center right away. But it's not a very good move, because after ed, if black takes with the queen, we have knight c3 attacking black's queen, and after d4 we open up the position to our favor. So black can try knight f6 with the idea to regain the pawn. But it has to be careful because after bishop b5 followed by c4, it might not be easy at all to regain this pawn, so it's very risky. For example here, white is simply a pawn up. b5 can be met by d3. Meanwhile, e6 is met by queen e2, and the pawn on e6 is very weak, and the pin is annoying. White is clearly better. Alternatively, black can block with the knight. Knight bd7, but again c4. Protecting the pawn on d5, and black doesn't have sufficient compensation after a6 takes d4, and white is a pawn up, and yeah, after e6 castle knight c3. Black has problems because he's a pawn down. Now his knight on f6 is pinned, and yeah, so move to d5 is just dubious. Alternatively, I'll move to... Let's also take a look at b6, which I don't even know what this line is called for black, but let's call it the b6 system. So black plays b6 in move 2, with the idea to play bishop b7 and attack our pawn. But the only problem with this move is after d4, black is severely behind in development, and he cannot play bishop b7 as d5 closes down the diagonal for this bishop. So here white is clearly better. The bishop on b7 is too passive, and now white can even play e5 followed by bishop f4. With the crushing position, so move 3 after d4, black has to take, and we recapture with the knight because it's very good square for the knight. b7 attacks our pawn on e4, and then we move knight to c3. So after knight c3, black's best move here is a6 in order to keep the b5 square firmly under his control and to prevent our pieces from getting to that square. Other moves are pretty bad in for black here. For example, e6 is suicidal because after knight db5, the weak squares on d6 and c7 are immediately exploited, and after d6 bishop f4 tax is pawn. And e5 actually loses to this knife, move knight d5 threatening a check on c7. And the main idea is after takes check, why does this knife move queen g for forcing the black king to move out, and king c6 is made after bishop b5. The king gets mated in the middle of the board, so after knight d5 our knights are well placed. And if knight a6 bishop e3, black's knight is badly placed and our knights are unstoppable. Knight f6 loses or doesn't lose, but it loses strategically after bishop g5, eliminating the knight with decisive effect. So on move 5, if black plays knight c6 to develop his queen's knight, this looks logical, but after bishop f4, the threats of knight d5 or knight d5 put black under a lot of pressure. For instance, after a6 we can take on c6. Black cannot take with the d-pawn because after queen d8, if he takes with the rook, then there is the move bishop c7 attacking the rook, and the pawn on b6. Meanwhile, if he takes with the bishop, then after knight d5, black cannot play rook c8, as pawn on a6 is hanging, so he has to take. But now, white does the bishop pair. And in addition, after knight f6, white does the very strong move queen d7 threatening to capture the pawn a6, and after queen c8 takes white as the two bishops. And in addition, the position quickly opens up. And after bishop d3, white has the pair of bishops and black cannot. If the rook retreats, then he is worse after king e2 and rook c1. Meanwhile, if black takes, this actually loses because the rook is trapped after bishop e5. Yeah, black loses by fourth. For example, after rook b4, rook c1 threatening, mate on the back rank, and check. And after f3, black is currently a pawn up, but his back rank is completely paralyzed, and the bishop on f8 cannot move. Oh sorry, excuse me, bishop on f8 cannot move, and all white has to do is bring the king's rook or the rook on h1 into the game, and this should be winning for white. On move 5, black can play knight f6 with the idea to provoke us to advance the e-pawn when after e5, black plays knight d5, and he hopes to survive that way. But after knight f6 we have this very strong move. Bishop g5 putting an unpleasant pin on black's knight, so yeah, after bishop g5, the main point is that black cannot take the pawn on e4 because if he takes, then black is a pawn up. But after queen g4, sorry with the idea to cast along. White's initiative is very dangerous, and we have a strong lead in development all in return for one pawn. So we are ready to cast along next move. For example, bishop d5, knight b5, starting knight d6, queen c8, long castle. And again, this position is very bad for black. Knight c6 probably loses because of bishop f4. Meanwhile, black plays knight a6. Then after bishop e2, black is a pawn up. But all the pieces are undeveloped if king is stuck in the center, and this should be a crushing position for white. In addition, knight c5 loses because of queen takes a8 followed by knight c7. So that move wasn't possible either. Meanwhile, on move 8, black can to play bishop b7, but after knight b5, the threat of knight d6 check is very unpleasant. And after f6, bishop f4, quite strong initiative. For example, if knight a6, then just long castle. Alternatively, e5 loses because of bishop takes and now queen h5, and white wins material. Actually, the point is black's king is very vulnerable, and after g6, queen takes or threatening the rook on h8. So black has to play queen e7, but now knight d6 is checked, taking advantage of the pin along the e-file, and after king d8 check, and black after king c8 knight d6. The main point is that black cannot take on d6 as our queen is free to move, and we grab the rook on h8, and white wins the exchange. So after knight d6, white is a clear pawn up, and black has no counterplay. So in move 5, black can also play a6, and again, as I said, this is the best move. But again, bishop g5 is the most energetic continuation. White has other good moves here as well, such as bishop e3, opting for a favorable version of the English attack. But this bishop move here is much more active because it puts pressure on this diagonal. And if black attacks our bishop, then we just retreat it, provoking back to weaken kingside. One game continued with knight c6. But after takes queen d4, the queen on d4 is in such a dominating position, controlling both sides of the board. And after b5, knight d5, knight f6, long castle, rook c8. This has been played in the game Zill against Wenzel. And now I suggest the move f4 with a clearly better position for white, because black's pieces on the king's side, and the king on e8 is in such a terrible state, and meanwhile our position is very safe, and we can play king b1 to further secure our queenside pawns. So move 6, queen c7 is the best move for black here, preparing to play e7, e6, and developing the dark squared bishop at all costs. So after queen c7, knight d5 is very strong. And this is the main point of the entire variation with bishop g5. So we attack black's pieces right away before he's able to consolidate with e6. If black plays queen e5, then we just play bishop e3. And if black takes, we transpose to the variation. Meanwhile, if black takes, then after e5. Again, we have won the bishop pair, and if he plays knight at 6, then after takes, white is clearly better here, because the pawn on d5 is very powerful and black's forces are cut off into 2. The queen's side cannot join the pieces on the king's side, and black's pawns here are extremely passive. White has light square control. So after he takes, black is recommended to give a check attacking our bishop, and then he should probably just try to grab this pawn, because at the very least he hits up a pawn, and he forces us to play accurately. But after queen d5, white plays bishop e2, threatening bishop f3, and in return for the sacrifice pawn, white gets a very strong initiative thanks to this powerful lead in development. And the threat of bishop f3 is very difficult to meet. For example, queen b7 does not help black, as after bishop f3. The pawns on b6 and c6 are very vulnerable in white castle's long next move. So after bishop e2, the threat of bishop f3 is extremely hard to meet. Black entire e5. But after knight f5, black squares on the d file is very vulnerable, and the pawn on b6 is hanging. So after takes, white has a powerful grip on this position. Pawn on b6 is hanging. Bishop f3 is his one idea, and white's advantage is large. For example, after g6, then we give check takes, and our rook is in such a dominating position. Coupled with our bishop pair, for example, there have been some games here. If black plays knight c6, then we castle short threatening rook d1. And if knight e7, it's actually very strong here to play the move g4. I mean, white has other moves too, but g4 is very powerful. The idea is we prevent black from playing knight f5, so we take away the f5 square from black's knight. And next we play rook d1. So here black is still up a pawn, but our bishops are very strong, and after f, for we open up the position for our bishop takes, and here white has a nice edge thanks to the bishops and the well-coordinated pieces. So we have pressure on the d-file after rook fd1, and the position is open so. So black's knights are clearly weaker than our bishops. On move 14, black can play knight e7, again threatening knight f5 or knight c8. But we can grab this pawn and regain our sacrifice material back. Black can play knight d5, but after rook d7, the rook is very powerfully placed on the 7th rank, and it prevents black from developing easily. So after takes, king f2 followed by rook d1, and it's not so easy to shake off white's pressure because after a3 our pawns are ready to advance on the queen's side with b4, and a5 is probably well met by bishop d5, and our rooks are very active next after rook d5. Meanwhile, rook ac8 has been played in a recent game. White played b4, and white has a large edge because our pawns are ready to advance with c4, and after e4, rook d5, we prevent rook knight e5, and we also activate our rook. So black played f6, but after c4 and b5, rook d4, our pieces are very active. And in addition, we have a queenside pawn majority, and after black's most accurate move, king e6 and h4 fixing the kingside pawns. Black's position looks quite solid, but after rook a6, the pawn on a5 is under attack, and black is hard-pressed to defend against our queenside pawn majority. Because he has no counterplay, rook takes a pipe as a threat, and if he plays rook a8 then, I think just taking the pawn here. White is a pawn up, and our queenside pawns should decide the game. So thanks again for watching this chapter, and I'll see you in the next one, where we'll discuss more minor Sicilian variations for black. Thank you.